Hello and welcome to Western Civ. In today's bonus author interview, I sit down with historian Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones, and we're talking about his most recent book, The Cleopatras, the Forgotten Queens of Egypt. And for those of you listening carefully, you'll note I said the Cleopatras, plural, not just the one that everyone knows. You see, the Ptolemies, like so many ancient and classical dynasties, had this habit of giving all of their kings and queens the same name. So it turns out every Ptolemaic Egyptian queen is named Cleopatra, at least after the first Cleopatra, who I get into when we're discussing the book with Llewellyn-Jones. It's a really well-written book, and of course we're going to talk about the Cleopatra that everyone knows, the one who was rolled up in the carpet. We get into that story as well. The one who has the love affair with Julius Caesar and then Mark Antony as well. So we do cover the famous one, but I think what's also interesting is that there were a lot of lesser-known Cleopatras whose influence on the Ptolemaic dynasty is really important to remember, because if that dynasty collapses before Julius Caesar shows up, well, it's a little bit of a different story. So if you are so inclined and you would like to pick up a copy of the book, you may click the link that's in the show notes. If you are listening to this, it is available right now. And without further ado, here is the interview with historian Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones. And welcome back. As I mentioned earlier, I'm sitting down with historian Lloyd Llewellyn-Jones, and we're talking about his most recent book, The Cleopatras, the Forgotten Queens of Egypt, available today. It's a really interesting book, and listeners are probably right now thinking, wait, Cleopatras, plural? And they're thinking, well, wait a minute, I thought there was only one Cleopatra. But in reality, this is a series of queens of Ptolemaic Egypt, which we're going to get into right now and is a fascinating subject. I wanted to start by asking, in general, you write about how this book is not merely for the famous Cleopatra, for the one that we all know, but also for the forgotten ones. But that kind of gets us to a broader question, I think, when we start to confront antiquity and the study of antiquity historically. And that is, aren't women generally sort of silent players throughout much of antiquity? And what do we lose when we essentially exclude half the population from our history books?
Yeah, that's precisely it, Adam. We do lose 50% of our materials if we do that, you know. Trying to get in touch with the voices of women in antiquity is never easy. However, there is some advantage when you're dealing with women of influence and power, so high-status women like queens, for instance. We have more records for them than we do for the average woman within ancient society. And I guess that's what I wanted to try to bring to the fore, really, is to try to upfront some of this supposedly lost materials about these women whose voices in history it's key for us to hear. I think it's very important. You know, that you're absolutely right again about the starting point of the book really was to say that, well, there's more than one Cleopatra. Cleopatra, the icon that we have, the Liz Taylor Cleopatra, you know, the one that we can't get away from at all, is a remarkable woman. And I think she's always been seen as a kind of lone wolf in many respects, a woman who stepped out of the shadows of a male-dominated society, took Rome by the scruff of its neck and really threw it around a bit. Well, I don't want to take away any of that from her because she was a remarkable individual. And as a woman, you know, she has been, therefore, an icon for many movements across many hundreds of years. You know, most recently, you know, she's been a feminist icon. She's been a Black Lives Matter icon, a Me Too movement icon, all of these things. I do not want to take any of that away. But as a historian, I'm very interested in knowing what Cleopatra was in her own lifetime. And she only becomes truly knowable to us when we put her into the context of the family in which she was reared and her own background, the kind of people that she knew. And so it became clear to me that really to understand Cleopatra VII, you really have to understand the 6 Cleopatras that preceded her. All these women of her family were called Cleopatra. It was the dynastic name par excellence. And every one of them tells quite a remarkable individual biography. Every one of them is worth studying. And I think that Cleopatra VII herself knew her family history. And really, they kind of make the blueprint for queenship that Cleopatra VII was able to pick up on and improve upon and ultimately perfect during her own tenure as Queen of Egypt. So I think that's why they're important. First of all, to give women's voices back, put them back into history, but also to put Cleopatra VII into her correct context.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask a little bit about, push on that just a little bit, because I'm interested in this idea of how, especially when we look at a figure like Cleopatra VII, how we deal with someone who has become an icon in many different ways. The problem is when you make someone an icon, oftentimes you reduce the depth that you're looking at them because you need them to fit a specific trope. So how do we go about with Cleopatra VII, sort of separating her from her fictionalized portrayal in the movies, and then also some of the, I'll say, baggage or ornaments that have sort of been put upon her throughout history? How do we get from that to the real woman?
It's difficult, because that image, or those multiple images, I should say, are so persuasive, and they've been around for so long that it's so easy to buy lock, stock, and barrel into them all. So the way that I've gotten back to the closest to Cleopatra that I can get back to is through documents produced during her own lifetime. I mean, that's the only way, and particularly trying to privilege the indigenous Egyptian and Greek sources wherever possible, because as you'll know, even in Cleopatra's own lifetime, the myth making was happening anyway. Both, within the Egyptian court, she was a brilliant PR woman in her own right. But more than that, of course, in Rome itself, where she was being villainized as this kind of Eastern temptress, this femme fatale, that kind of image starts very, very early, even before Cleopatra's death itself. So it was to kind of go beyond those sources to look at the original materials as much as possible. Because, for a woman who has been written about as much as Cleopatra VII, it's quite astonishing how much bad scholarship is out there. And how many times scholars cling to rumour and speculation more than anything else. I wanted to do away with all of that for all of the Cleopatras. I wanted to present them as living flesh and blood women who operated in remarkable times. You might remember that only a few months ago, Netflix brought out a documentary called Queen Cleopatra, which was to do with her race and so forth, and it has been derided and so forth. And a lot of that, her kind of black identity that was put forward in that documentary was about the supposition that we don't know Cleopatra VII's mother at all. And so there's always been this gap in our knowledge that, was she an Egyptian courtesan and all this kind of thing? Well, it's absolute rubbish, because we know who Cleopatra VII's mother was. It's Cleopatra VI, and she was a Greek-speaking Ptolemaic princess, and we find that in the Egyptian evidence. If you're not looking in the right places, if you don't go finding the right sources, you're not going to get the right answers. And those sources are not necessarily conveniently collected for us in a everything you want to know about Cleopatra kind of volume. But if I went to back to the wall reliefs of the temple of Edfu. And there, without any doubt, we have an inscription that mentions Ptolemy the 12th, Cleopatra's father, together with Cleopatra the 6th, and their two daughters. And this dates to about 3 years after Cleopatra the 7th's birth. So we can say absolutely clearly that we know that Cleopatra's mother was a Greek-speaking Ptolemaic heiress. And we don't need further speculation. There's enough speculation going around. Let's pin down some facts is what I'm about.
And if you know anything about dynastic legitimacy within antiquity at all, the notion that Cleopatra the Seventh would be promoted because she has a sister over her sister, and be an illegitimate child is absolutely absurd.
Absolutely, and if there's one thing the Greeks the Romans would have gone for is her illegitimacy. I mean, they would have absolutely pounded her on that without any doubt. And there's no slurs of illegitimacy at all thrown at Cleopatra by her Roman detractors, which for me, therefore, writes that whole idea out of history entirely.
Yeah, the notion that Caesar Augustus could be handed this propaganda coup and not use it is a little bit beyond the pale of his normal behavior, certainly. Don't forget, listeners of the show will remember, in the Roman Civil War with Marcus Antonius, Caesar Augustus declared war essentially on Egypt. That was this was all part of a show to a large extent. But let's just back up and just kind of answer a basic question right away, because some listeners are probably wondering, okay, why is every queen named Cleopatra? Why does each queen of Ptolemaic Egypt share the same name? Why is that?
First of all, I think it's important to note it's probably not a birth name. They were all given different names. We know, for instance, that the Cleopatra VI, her real name was Tryphina. So in some of the inscriptions, she's called Tryphina, who is known as Cleopatra. So Cleopatra seems to have been a throne name that most of these royal women took. And its rationale is twofold, I think. First of all, there's some mythological background to this. So we have some Greek female mythical figures, the daughter of Boreas and this kind of thing. The daughter of the founder of Troy are called Cleopatra. But in the historical realm, Alexander the Great's only sister, and probably the woman he loved most in his life, the woman he trusted most in his life, was named Cleopatra. And of course, what we're dealing with the Ptolemies is a dynasty of Macedonians. So I think that gives them a kind of pedigree. It's a name that was good enough for Alexander's sister. But then, of course, you can break down the name, and I think its meaning really appeals to the Cleopatras. So it's a compound of two Greek words, kleos, which means glory or renown, fame, that kind of thing. And then, of course, we have patros, which is of the father or of the fatherland. So when you come down to it, Cleopatra means something like the glory of the fathers or the glory of the fatherland, the renown of the fatherland, that kind of thing. So as a kind of patriotic moniker, really, for these women, I think it's very important. And I think that's something that, some early writers about the life of Cleopatra VII recognise. So if you've ever read Plutarch's Life of Antony, continually through that book, Cleopatra is simply addressed as Egypt. And this is something that Shakespeare takes up in Antony and Cleopatra, for instance. And I think that probably comes from this idea that she herself and her ancestors promoted their identification as the glory of Egypt, the glory, the renown of the household, that kind of thing. So it's a name which has a great resonance. It can also be used as a little sort of diminutive, like a little pet name as well. And when you translate it as a pet name, it comes down to something like Daddy's Girl, which is kind of cool because not one of these women were Daddy's girls.
That's interesting. Well, let's start talking about a couple of the lesser-known Cleopatras. Cleopatra Sira, for all practical purposes, the first Cleopatra. She's not born in Egypt. She's the daughter of Antiochus III, who's one of these successors. You talk about Alexander the Great, so listeners will remember after Alexander's death, his vast kingdom was divided up amongst his various successors, and they fought each other in a series of wars lasting for a relatively long period of time. time. But some of these successor kingdoms are still kicking around at the time that Rome comes calling. And so how does she get to Egypt, this first Cleopatra, given the fact that she is not born originally in Egypt?
Well, she serves a purpose for her father, Antiochus III, and basically he enters her into the marriage game, which was the lot of many Hellenistic princesses in that period, of course. Essentially, the whole of the Hellenistic world was a war zone after the death of Alexander and continued to be a war zone for the next 300 years. And it was the Ptolemies and the Seleucids ruling in essentially the Levant and Asia itself, and the Ptolemies in Egypt that were at loggerheads constantly. So there were always raids over the borders, land grabbing, and nothing was ever really getting resolved at all. And just like today, Israel-Palestine was constantly a seat for the theatre of war. And so Cleopatra Syra, the Syrian, was used by her father as a kind of political pawn, really, in crafting an alliance with the Egyptian monarchy. And she was sent off to Egypt to marry King Ptolemy V. And Ptolemy very much needed a bride because all the other Ptolemies before him had married their sisters. And this was an absolutely acceptable way of operating within the Ptolemaic dynasty. They were drawing on a kind of a God-given incest, which had been practiced by Egyptian and Greek gods. Isis and Osiris, Zeus and Hera had been brother and sisters, but also husband and wives. But Ptolemy V didn't have a sister, so he was actually actively looking for a wife. And so at the age of about 21, Cleopatra Syra was bundled off to Alexandria to marry Ptolemy V, who was a few years, maybe even more than a decade younger than her. She didn't know him at all. It was a huge risk. Some writers at the time predicted that her marriage to Ptolemy would see the end of Egypt because clearly the girl was going into Egypt so that she could carry out her father's Seleucid ambitions and ruin the throne. But that didn't happen at all. In fact, Cleopatra I proves herself to be a very, very capable queen consort, to such an extent, in fact, that within 10 years of her marriage to Ptolemy V, in all of the correspondence and also in the inscriptions set up on Egyptian temple walls, she gets the honorary title Sister of the King. So she's kind of given this position that she wasn't actually born with, but something that the Ptolemies wanted. And we know that she was incredibly popular with the Egyptians, especially the peoples of Alexandria. They just seemed to take her to their heart. She became the first example of the people's princess, I suppose, amongst the Alexandrians. So she did extremely well, because as you can imagine, going into a foreign court, you are looked at with very hostile eyes. That's been the experience of many, many princesses marrying into royal courts in world history, of course. But Cleopatra I is one of those who actually successfully pulled it off.
Well, I want to ask a follow-up question to that, which is when we think of Cleopatra Syra going to Egypt, what should we think of when we think of Egypt at this point in history? Because obviously Egypt at this point is thousands of years old already, and I think people don't realize just how old Egypt is. And so what kind of an Egypt would she have experienced? So should we be thinking Great Pyramids here, or should we be thinking more Lighthouse of Alexandria?
Well, it's a little bit of both, actually. And the more work we do on the archaeology of this period, and particularly in the site of Alexandria itself, the more we are understanding how much of a mashup Ptolemaic society really was between traditional pharaonic Egyptian and newfangled Greek. So the landscape of Alexandria itself, while extensively it was a Greek-looking city, was nevertheless embellished with sphinxes and obelisks that were actually uprooted from different parts of Egypt and brought by the Ptolemaic pharaohs into Egypt. The Ptolemies, who had been on the throne for 150 years by this time, were very, very keen to assimilate themselves into Egyptian society. Egypt came as a kind of ready-made package, if you like. You know, it had its antiquity, its traditions, its culture, which was very, very strong. So the Ptolemies realized there's no way that we can beat this, so we'll join them instead. And so every Ptolemaic king and every Ptolemaic queen kind of represented themselves in a kind of sort of bilingual way, if you like. So they would have their images printed on their coins, in which they looked entirely Greek. But then if you look at them on wall reliefs from the temples of Upper Egypt, they look thoroughly pharaonic. And it was this sort of bilingual style of operation that was successfully put into place by the Ptolemies throughout the 300 years of their dynastic rule. Now, that doesn't mean to say that everything was always going well. There were rebellions in Upper Egypt, so the areas of ancient Thebes, Aswan, modern-day Luxor and Aswan, and Alexandria was always seen as being something beyond Egypt because it was its own identity. It was very, Greek-centered. And in fact, the Greeks themselves always called Alexandria pros Egyptu, Alexandria which is next to Egypt. So it wasn't even seen as kind of being integral into Egypt. And the Ptolemies had encouraged Greek settlement in Alexandria and the Nile Delta from their first arrival. So, for instance, soldiers, Greek soldiers coming from anywhere in the Greek world, if they settled in Egypt, they would be given a grant of land and a substantial bit of money as well. And increasingly throughout the Ptolemaic period, immigration into Egypt was actively encouraged by the Ptolemaic rulers towards the Greek-speaking world. So we do have this mashup of Egyptian and Greek populations, sometimes merging and getting on, but also quite clearly there are times when they don't get along at all. And I think that's one of the really fascinating things about the Hellenistic period as a whole to study, because it's a time when identity was being questioned and when new identities were being formed. And I think in this day and age, it's a very, very important point of history for us to reflect on when, so much of our own frustrations and misunderstandings are around issues of identity. Going back to the Hellenistic world can really open up some questions and debates and possibly provide some answers to our own concerns with that major theme.
Yeah, that's interesting because, of course, listeners will remember Alexander the Great, was very invested in this idea of sort of melding these cultures together and stitching things in such a way that he could create something truly new, something more multinational, perhaps maybe the first effort at globalization that we know. Let me turn and ask a question about Cleopatra II, because I think in Cleopatra II, so we get the first sort of Ptolemaic princess that is a Cleopatra, and then that gives us an indication of sort of what was the value that the Ptolemaic house ultimately placed on its female members, on its princesses?
Well, in Egypt, for many millennia, there had been this kind of theological notion that monarchy was a duality, so that you kind of needed a male and a female principle. So the pharaoh would always have a wife, and just by a sort of really sort of osmosis, she took on something of his divinity, and she represented the kind of goddess figures of the Egyptian pantheon, where he represented the gods. So the Ptolemaic queens embraced that aspect of Egyptian theology wholeheartedly, and I think that most Egyptian subjects of the Ptolemies felt that the world was much more at ease when there was this regular male-female aspect on the throne together. And I think that's what the Cleopatras really capitalize on, and in their propaganda, that's something that they stress constantly. But Cleopatra II, who was the eldest daughter of Cleopatra I, she had to struggle with some of those images quite a lot throughout her life, because the men in her life, her two brothers, didn't quite play according to the rules very often. So she has two brothers, Ptolemy VI, whom she marries and has children with, and then also Ptolemy VIII. He's known to history as Potbelly because he was an enormously fat man with enormous ambitions to match his appetite. And at one point in her life, Cleopatra II finds herself sharing a throne with both of her brothers at the same time, which completely puts into a spin this whole idea of duality constantly. These two brothers were absolutely at loggerheads. They were chalk and cheese. There was nothing harmonious about their relationship. And Cleopatra II spent a good part of her life trying to act as intercessor and placator for these two men. She was far more capable than both of her brothers in terms of politicking, and we really get a sense of that from the documentation, especially from Roman documentation, interestingly, because Rome was increasingly becoming involved in Egyptian and Mediterranean affairs at this period. And the Roman ambassadors were always keener to talk and deal with Cleopatra II than they were to deal with either of her brother pharaohs, which is kind of interesting. When Ptolemy VI died, after a reign of about 17 years, then Cleopatra VII had to marry her brother, Potbelly, and that was a very uncomfortable marriage in many respects. She had already had 5 children with Ptolemy VI, and now with Potbelly she had one more son. And they called this boy Memphites because he was born at Memphis during Potbelly's coronation. And Cleopatra II at this point, at the time of the delivery of her last child, was into her late 40s, which for antiquity was stretching the age, and to have a last child. So I think she knew, really, that her childbearing days were over, and that therefore everything for her future depended on this boy growing to maturity, becoming the pharaoh, so she could become the queen mother, essentially. Otherwise she'd be defunct. But opposition to that came from within her immediate family, when shortly after the birth of Memphites, her youngest daughter by her first marriage to Ptolemy VI, if you're keeping up, she married her uncle, stepfather, Potbelly. So for this bizarre moment, we have Potbelly as pharaoh and 2 queens on the throne, both of whom are mother and daughter. That did not make for harmonious households, as you can well imagine. Especially when Cleopatra III, who was about 18, therefore very fertile, gave birth to no less than 5 children for Potbelly. And Potbelly, I think, seeing really that the future lay with Cleopatra III, his youngest wife, and their children, he actually murdered Memphites. So he kills his own son, basically to stop Cleopatra II's ambitions from flourishing beyond that point. So these dynastic politics are messy affairs where emotions and proximity to members of the family really are put into play. It reads that the House of Ptolemy's history reads like a kind of soap opera or a Verdi opera plot. It's a grand guignol spectacle. It's a macabre kind of story very often, and you wouldn't believe it unless it's written down. And this is history. This is why I think fact is so much more entertaining than fiction very often.
It's so messy. It's interesting to me because you kind of think about this system that the idea is, of course, well, we'll have sister marry brother, and that will keep everything within the family and sort of keep it more. I don't want to use the word civil, but it'll at least be more. Right, it'll at least be more logical. We won't have factionalism and so on and so forth, but you still do. You can't really get around that. And that's something that we see in a lot of these civilizations throughout history who practice the same thing of, sibling marriage.
Oh, absolutely. And just the whole adage of, keep your enemies close, but your friends closer still. Well, I think that's even doubled when you think about relatives as well. Regardless of whether these marriages are incestuous, I think family is the dynamic that leads history always. And I think if we forget the fact that, behind these great empires, there are family units slogging it out for prestige and power, then we're doing history a great disservice. If we think of the Ptolemaic realm essentially as a family-run business, then what happens at the center of that family has repercussions for all of the subjects of the realm, of course. And this is what's really played out here. And from that moment on, with Cleopatra II and Cleopatra III, generation after generation, each of the Ptolemies and the Cleopatras are engaged in what almost is civil war within the family itself. There are no deeds too dark and no corners too far off that can't be explored by this group of dynasts. It's as far from the Walton's image as a wholesome family as you could possibly get. This is real soap opera territory.
Yeah, it's almost this catch-22 when you have this sort of family-run kingdom, and it's a family business, and a lot of these are family businesses, let's be honest, that's what they are, where you want to have enough children, enough sons, so that in case one dies, you have someone who can take over. But then if you go too far and you have too many children and too many sons, tears it apart.
And you can put a real sort of Darwinian twist on this as well. I've been really interested in looking at sort of wildlife documentaries and looking at Darwin's theories on how animals operate. So if you think about a pride of lions and lionesses, you'll have a successfully mating couple, and the lioness will give birth to maybe two males, and then a new lion will come in and challenge the pride, kill the first lion or drive the lion off, and then of course he'll take over the harem of lionesses, and the first thing he'll do is to kill the cubs of the preceding lion. And very often as well, lionesses will turn and kill the cubs of rival lionesses too. There's something in DNA which is about competition, and Darwin put his finger on it. He said this is what's going on here. And I think in the deeply interrelated families that we have in the Hellenistic world in particular, we really see that Darwinian paradigm in operation here.
Well, turning back from family murder to more geopolitics for a second, I wanted to ask about something that you brought up in our last question, which was about Roman ambassadors. So how does the emergence of Rome as really a superpower in the 2nd century BCE, how does that alter Ptolemaic Egypt's position within the Eastern Mediterranean?
Yeah, up until the middle of the 2nd century, Rome opts to play a kind of long-distance game with Egypt. Rome isn't particularly keen to get involved with Egyptian affairs. But increasingly, as an empire is being created by the Romans, and certainly after Macedon falls to Rome, and then, of course, Romans enter into Asia Minor and then into the Levant, so more and more interest is placed on Egypt. Egypt has been of interest to the Romans because of its wealth. Egypt always had direct access to gold reserves, but also it was known as the breadbasket of antiquity because of the fertile land. So it was always known to be super wealthy, and the Romans liked the idea of that. But interestingly, what really brings Rome into the orbit of Egypt is the fact that these dynastic crises being played out within the royal family of the Ptolemies was impacting on the wealth of Egypt, because each successive Ptolemy or Cleopatra, determined to cling on to the throne or to put a son or daughter on the throne, very often used the Roman Senate as leverage for that. So they would ask the Senate to endorse such and such an individual as the next pharaoh or queen. And alongside that endorsement went a very large handover of money. So the Egyptians were squandering millions and millions of silver coins every year on trying to source Roman support for the maintenance of their dynasty. And with this, of course, Rome became increasingly realistic about the wealth of Egypt. And by the time we get to a generation before Cleopatra VII comes to the throne, so under Cleopatra V and Cleopatra VI, Ptolemy XII, we have really Egypt paying for its right to survive, and Rome will leave them alone. But by that period, Egypt has found itself with Rome as its near neighbours, both to the east and the west. In 80 BCE, the Levant, Syria, fell to the Romans. And then in the 60s BCE, Cyrenaica, which is in North Africa, the kingdom next to Egypt, was given to Rome as a gift by one of the bastard sons of Potbelly. And so, for the first time, the Egyptians actually have a physical presence of Rome on both of its borders. And so from there on in, of course, it plays a much bigger role. And really, you see, knowing that and knowing the background of this helps explain Cleopatra VII's Roman policies so much more. Why she threw in her lot with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony in the way that she did. She saw the humiliation that her father, Ptolemy XII, had gone through, virtually on his knees begging for Roman support and pouring money into the togaed laps of these Roman senators. And she didn't want that to happen again. She wanted to play politics on her own terms, secure the longevity of Egypt by a different means. And this is why she basically threw in a lot with these two influential Romans.
And that's a great segue, because then I wanted to bring up Cleopatra VII. And let's talk about her a little bit, because it's the one that everybody knows. And of course, where I want to start is, you mentioned Julius Caesar and her relationship to Julius Caesar. So I think what most listeners think of when they think of that relationship is how Cleopatra essentially smuggles herself into the palace. She's wrapped up inside this carpet, and then she's able to come out and meet with him because she's been blocked from doing so by a brother and a brother's ministers. So first of all, as an initial thing, is there any way we can confirm that story is actually true?
Well, yes, I think we can. Plutarch, who tells us the story in most detail, and he's writing, a good 250 years after the death of Cleopatra, he probably used as one of his sources a now lost source, tragically, that was written by Cleopatra's chief aide, a man called Apollodorus. And he alone probably would have had access to this kind of material, because he was the one who smuggled Cleopatra into the Alexandrian palace. The details that Plutarch tell are so specific that it can almost only have come from an eyewitness. So, for instance, Hollywood has done us no favour with all of this, both in sort of, Claudette Colbert and Liz Taylor have both been rolled out of a rug, as you say. In fact, it was a kind of a sack or a sleeping bag kind of thing that travellers would have used to keep straw and hay in to feed the animals. So it was a pretty incongruous thing that she was snuck into. It seems to have happened. I don't really have any doubts about that. And we also know that she charmed Caesar within one night. They slept together that very night, and the next morning he was captivated by her quite clearly, and he goes about really re-establishing her on the throne next to her brother Ptolemy the 13th. So it was win-win for Cleopatra the 7th at that point. I think that probably the story of Caesar and Cleopatra was a love story. I think they had tremendous regard for one another. They were both fantastic intellectuals, clearly both of them highly charismatic as well, and I think they made each other tick. That's pretty sure. Within a few months of coming back to Alexandria, Cleopatra got Caesar to do what thousands of people ever since have, and they took a Nile cruise right the way down to Aswan and then back again. And by the time she returned to Alexandria, she was pregnant with Caesar's child. And throughout their relationship, I think they had enormous respect for one another as politicians, as intellectuals as well. Now, Mark Antony, though, is a different fish altogether. There was nothing intellectual about Mark Antony whatsoever. I mean, he was a brute soldier with brute force. He liked a night out with his squaddies. He was a hard drinker, hard liver, and even though he had aspirations to be a philosopher, he didn't really understand anything that was ever read to him. So we see a very different track being played by Cleopatra the 7th when she's with Antony, and she snares a kind of vulgar man via vulgar means. So, no talk of Plato or Aristotle for them. No, instead it was, luxury yachts, Cleopatra dressing up as the goddess Venus, him dressing up as the god Bacchus or Dionysus. It was drinking, it was partying in the streets, it was conga lines through Alexandria. That was the kind of way that she approached Mark Antony. So I think you see in her two relationships with these two Roman men, monogamous relationships as well, incidentally. She wasn't this kind of femme fatale that we've had her play. These two monogamous relationships, she changes, she morphs her persona to be able to secure her position with both of these men. And I think it's highly likely that this is something that Plutarch tells us, had Octavian, the future Augustus Caesar, succumbed to her charms in the last few days of her life as well, she probably would have changed once again, morphed again, in order to make an alliance of whatever kind with him too. She was an expert politician, and she knew how to use her intellect and her body in very skillful ways.
Well, building off that and talking about Mark Antony for a little bit, I'm curious, you had talked about how Caesar's relationship with Cleopatra did seem to be one of sort of genuine affection and love. Was her relationship driven in the same way with Mark Antony, or was this more of sort of a political necessity that she needs to bring together?
I think that, in spite of the wonders of Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra and the romance that was Burton Taylor, I do not think that the Antony and Cleopatra relationship was one of particular emotional significance for the Queen. I think, sexually they clearly struck a chord together, but I think Cleopatra was more headstrong and more insightful as a politician than Mark Antony could ever dream to have been. And I think she used that very pragmatically to endorse not necessarily her own power, but the power of her son, Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar. Caesarion's birth is an axial moment in Cleopatra's life. When he is born, he becomes the chief object of all of her focus and drive. Her ambition is never about setting herself up independently as a queen, as a regent, as a queen regnant in Egypt. Everything is to do with Caesarion. And Mark Antony seems to have been willing to endorse Caesarion's role, both as the offspring of Cleopatra and of Julius Caesar. He said many times in public that he endorsed Caesarion as Julius Caesar's son and heir, thereby, of course, diminishing any right that Octavian had to Caesar's fortune or to Caesar's power. And of course, that's really what marks the difference there. I think that Mark Antony was just blind enough to allow Cleopatra to do that. I mean, there's this most ostentatious and egregious ceremony that Antony and Cleopatra and their children participate in Alexandria some 3 or 4 years before the fall, in which Mark Antony stands in front of the whole of the community of Alexandria and he distributes the whole of the eastern part of Rome's empire to Cleopatra and her children. Even those parts of the empire that didn't belong to Rome at the time, he was willingly giving away. Well, you can imagine how that went down in the Senate at Rome. I mean, this is talking about overstepping a boundary. At that point, Cleopatra VII gives herself new titles. She is called the Queen of Kings, and also she calls herself Cleopatra Nea Athea Neteria, the new goddess, the new Isis as well. So she becomes the kind of living goddess on earth as well. So this is this kind of stuff really that sent Octavian, who himself was a cold-hearted politician, into spasms, while Antony doesn't seem to have really understood the weight of what he was doing. That's my reading for Antony anyway.
Yeah, so this event, the donations of Alexandria, is an epic PR disaster for Mark Antony, and I agree, he doesn't seem to have understood the ramifications of what he was doing, and this is the event that sort of precipitates the final conclusion of this protracted period of civil war that's lasted for most of the time since the death of Julius Caesar. And after the Battle of Actium, when Cleopatra and Mark Antony are just sort of roundly defeated, what sort of options remained for Cleopatra? She is this consummate politician who seems to be able to change herself repeatedly to make herself into a chameleon. And what is her plan? What's her strategy after it seems as though it is no longer militarily feasible to come out on top against Octavian?
Well, interestingly, the records show us that the first thing that she and Mark Antony do is to go into an act of denial straight away, and they host a huge party in Alexandria, and this is to celebrate Caesarion's coming of age. So they don't show any remorse and they show no fear initially. But as the Roman troops begin to encroach on Alexandria closer and closer as they sweep down the Levant, across the border of Pelusium and into Egypt, so Cleopatra starts to put some plans into practice. One of the things she does is that she transports several ships down the Nile and has them taken across the Arabian desert, the Western desert, to the Red Sea. And that's basically to prepare a quick escape, certainly for Caesarion, if not for herself as well. The interesting story where she tells Antony, or sends a message that she has killed herself, and then Antony, commits suicide on the back of that, is a feasible one. You could say that what Cleopatra is doing there is detaching herself from this disastrous mistake she's made now that Octavian is fast approaching. So would this give her a new calling card? Equally, I think that Antony himself would have known what would have awaited him had he been taken a prisoner of Octavian. I mean, Antony himself had seen the orator Cicero's hands, put on a stake in the Forum. After all, he knew the realities of politicking in Rome. So whether his suicide was participated by Cleopatra or was self-motivated, we don't know. I think maybe a little bit of a mix of both. Cleopatra went into a kind of trying to bide time for her children, essentially. She began a hunger strike. And when Octavian entered Alexandria at the beginning of August 30 BCE, this is how he found the queen, in this hunger strike. And they forced her to eat and so forth, but she wouldn't take any food. And then he promised that her children would not be harmed. And so she started eating again. And then, of course, there's the final act. And we don't really know much about this icon that we have of Cleopatra's death by snakebite. Not all the sources are agreed on that at all. In fact, the earliest sources we have, Cassius Dio and Strabo, they simply say that after her death, small punctures were found on her forearms, and they say, this could have been pin pricks or pricks from a comb, which were laced with poison. That was how it was originally thought she had died. And then about a century after her death, we get the stories of the asp itself. And I suppose that becomes the go-to story, because the association of the snake with the throne of Egypt, on her crown, Cleopatra VII had the uraeus, which was the eye of Re, which was a cobra ready to strike. So I think that's where the kind of legend gets started about this. But actually the real story of Cleopatra's death is much harder to pin down. We do know that Octavian went out of his way to make sure that she should be taken alive as a prisoner. And I think that's the last thing Cleopatra wanted, because 10 years earlier, she had seen her own sister, Arsinoe, dragged through the streets of Rome as a prisoner of war in one of Julius Caesar's triumphs. And of course, this is what Octavian wanted for Cleopatra, probably to be executed on the Capitoline Hill. So she would not allow that to happen. And this is why the suicide occurs. She seems to have sent her son, Caesarion, down the Nile, ready to cross into Arabia, but he was betrayed by a group of local Egyptians who handed him over to the Romans, and he was killed within 2 or 3 days of Cleopatra's suicide, which was all in vain. And yet, at the same time, has done her the greatest service of all. It's mythologized her. And there was... I finished the book with a quotation from a Greek author called Lucian, who was writing in the 2nd century, and he writes a treatise on how to be a historian. And he says, if you're going to be a historian, you really have to know your materials. You have to know all the sources available to you. And he says, for me, I would like to write a history of the world, starting with the creation of the universe and ending with the death of Cleopatra the Egyptian. which is really fascinating. I think it's almost for Lucian. He's saying history stops when Cleopatra died, and I think there's something about that. Certainly, history would never be the same again after Cleopatra's death.
Well, that's really interesting, and I think it's an amazing book, and it really does move us beyond this image of just the one Cleopatra that people know. Well, we've talked about a lot of stuff, but is there anything else that you absolutely want the listeners to know about the book before we kind of wrap it up here?
No, just to encourage them to go buy it, go read it, and maybe then think more about those kind of female figures who seem to be lost from history, and how might we find their voices again. Use it as a point of encouragement to go find out about women's history in antiquity, but also about this really fascinating period, which we call the Hellenistic era. It's really worth investigating.
Well, I love the Hellenistic era. It's one of the most fascinating periods in history to me. After the fracturing of Alexander's quick-won empire, and then the ability of the different successors to maintain it. And I'm also fascinated by Cleopatra VII, the role that she plays, all the different people that she came into contact with throughout her life. These huge names, Julius Caesar, Octavian, Marcus Antonius, all of these people, like she's kind of the glue that stitches it together, just to be able to sit down and talk with her for a couple of minutes.
Exactly. And, these Cleopatras have had, when people have noted them at all, they've had really bad press. So, Cleopatra II, Cleopatra III, they're called things like tigresses, or disparaged in terms of saying that they were despicable women, plotting, mischievous. And I was asking myself as I was putting all the material together, so what's their crime? What really is their crime? If they were men murdering and killing their way to power, we would think nothing of it whatsoever. Their crime is that they were women, and that's the way they've been judged in the historiography. Well, we've got to get over that. We've got to go beyond that now and actually look female power in the face and say, it can be as crucial as male power, and they will use exactly the same methods to capture power as any man would do as well. So I think I'm sure I've written something of a feminist treaty, but it's one that I think is genuinely reflective of the times.
Yeah, and I think it's just, we have to use this, if we're going to judge leaders and rulers, well, then we have to use the same standard for both genders, or it's not remotely fair. And I think that that's a valid point. And that is what you get in a lot of these old sources. You get these characterizations of these different women, especially in antiquity, that are just kind of they're just jammed into tropes sometimes that don't really make any sense. But I want to thank you so much for coming on. It is an amazing book. It will deepen everyone's understanding not only of the famous Cleopatra, but of the really instrumental women who came before her. So thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a lovely chat.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Adam. Thank you for having me.